So, I want you to picture a map of the world.
Okay, like a globe.
Yeah, but not the political map you see in a classroom, with the different colored countries.
Right.
I want you to picture the map that sits inside the head of a distinct policy planner in Washington, D.C. around, say, 1992.
Ah, the unipolar map.
Exactly. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has just dissolved. And if you are looking at that mental map in the early 90s, you don't see rivals.
No, you really don't.
You don't see a balance of power. You basically see a globe that is, for all intents and purposes, yours to manage.
It was that classic end of history moment.
Right.
The prevailing sentiment back then was that liberal democracy and market capitalism, specifically the American version, had just won.
Won permanently.
Permanently, yeah. Like the game was over.
So today we are doing a deep dive into what happens when that map, that mental model of total dominance, collides with reality 30 years later.
And it's a harsh collision.
It is. Because we have a stack of material here that argues the war in Ukraine, the rising tensions with China, the instability in the Middle East. None of these are separate, isolated events.
Right. According to the source material we are unpacking today, they're all connected.
Yep.
We are looking at a really rigorous discussion between political economist Glenn Deason and Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And they argue these global crises are all symptoms of the exact same root cause.
Which is what?
The collapse of a very specific strategy the U.S. has been running since the Berlin Wall fell.
Yeah, we are looking at a very detailed exchange here. And I'll be honest, reading through Sachs's contributions, the tone is striking.
It really is.
He isn't just presenting data. He is actively dissecting what he views as a catastrophic failure of Western statecraft.
He is. And we should probably clarify for the listener who Jeffrey Sachs is in this context.
So.
Because he isn't just an academic observer writing from some university office.
Yep.
He was physically in the room during these key historical transitions.
Literally in the room.
Yeah, he was an economic advisor to the Solidarity movement in Poland back in 1989.
Right.
He was an advisor to Gorbachev and then Yeltsin in the early 90s as the Soviet Union collapsed.
Wow.
So he has the receipts, sometimes literally the meeting minutes of how the West moved from this idea of building a common European home to the highly fractured situation we face today.
So the core argument he's making here forces us to totally rethink our timeline.
It does.
Because if you ask a random person on the street when the war in Ukraine started, they will almost certainly say February 24th, 2022.
The day the tanks rolled in.
Right, the day of the invasion. Now, if you ask someone who follows foreign policy a bit more closely, they might say 2014.
Referencing the Maidan protests?
Yeah, the protests and the annexation of Crimea.
But Sachs argues that if you really want to understand why the tanks rolled, you have to go back way further.
Much further.
He frames the current conflict not as a sudden explosion of aggression, but as essentially the violent 12-year anniversary of a coup.
A coup, which itself was the result of decisions made way back in 1990.
Exactly. He is tracing a straight line from the champagne popping in Washington in 1992 directly to the trenches in the Donbas today.
And the central theme of that timeline is this tension between hegemony and peace.
Right.
Sachs argues these are mutually exclusive goals. Like, you can try to dominate the world or you can try to live at peace with it.
But you cannot do both.
You cannot do both. So let's define hegemony in this context before we move on, because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot.
It does.
When Sachs uses it, what is he specifically describing here?
Well, he's describing a security architecture where the United States is not just the leading power, but the only power that is permitted to set the rules.
The sole rulemaker.
Yeah, it implies that no other nation can have a sphere of influence or even independent security concerns that override American desires.
Okay, so let's go back to that moment in the 1990s, that hubris of the unipolar moment.
It was a wild time.
It was. Looking back, it felt like a time of immense optimism, right? The nuclear drills in schools stopped. The overarching existential threat was just gone.
Yeah, the relief was palpable.
So why does Sachs view this specific era as the origin of the disaster?
Because of the massive discrepancy between what was being told to the public and what was actually being written in the strategy documents behind closed doors. While the public narrative was all about the spread of democracy and freedom, the internal narrative in the Pentagon and the White House was strictly about securing permanent dominance.
And this is where we run into the Wolfowitz doctrine, right?
Exactly. This was a defense planning guidance document from 1992 overseen by Paul Wolfowitz.
And it leaked.
It was leaked to the New York Times, and it caused a massive stir that was pretty quickly hushed up by the administration.
What did it actually say?
The language was stark. It explicitly stated that the first objective of the U.S. was to prevent the reemergence of a new rival.
Prevent the reemergence.
Yes, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or anywhere else in the world.
Okay, so the goal wasn't to integrate a new democratic Russia into the global fold.
Not at all.
It was to ensure Russia could never recover enough to be a peer.
That is exactly how Sachs reads it. The strategy was to ensure that no power, not Russia, not China, not even a unified Europe, could ever challenge U.S. dictates again.
Wow. And there's a specific figure who really embodies this thinking. Someone Sachs refers to repeatedly in the source text, Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Yes, the intellectual godfather of U.S. primacy.
Right.
He was Carter's national security advisor, but his influence extended decades beyond that administration. In the 90s, he wrote a very famous book called The Grand Chessboard.
I've actually read excerpts of it. It's very clinical.
Highly clinical.
Yeah.
In that text, he grapples with what to do with Russia.
Right.
He didn't argue for a Marshall Plan to rebuild it. He actually speculated that a unified Russia might simply be too much of a problem for the U.S. to manage.
So he suggested breaking it up.
He did. He floated the idea of a loosely confederated Russia, effectively splitting the country into three separate entities.
3 Russias.
Yes, a European Russia,
Yeah.
a Siberian Republic, and a Far Eastern Republic.
Okay, I want you to pause on that for a second. 3 Russias. If you are a Russian strategist sitting in the Kremlin in the mid-90s,
Right.
and you are reading that the leading strategic thinker in Washington wants to literally slice your country into 3 pieces, how does that shape your view of American intentions?
I mean, it confirms your absolute worst paranoia.
Yeah.
It tells you that the U.S. doesn't want a partner. They want a carcass.
A carcass, wow.
They want access to the immense resources of Siberia without having to deal with the political weight of Moscow.
And this wasn't just abstract theory in a book. Sachs argues this mindset drove the actual economic policy of the entire decade?
Yes.
This brings us to what the source calls the tale of 2 economies.
This is where Sachs's personal testimony becomes so vital to the narrative.
Right, because he lived it.
He did. He was uniquely positioned to see the difference in how the West treated its friends versus how it treated its defeated rivals.
Because he was doing the exact same job in 2 different countries, right?
Essentially, yes. In 1989, he is in Poland.
Okay.
And Poland is in a state of total collapse. Hyperinflation, massive shortages, crippling debt.
Really bad shape.
So Sachs designs a radical stabilization plan. But he tells Western leaders, this plan is just paper, unless you back it with real money. We need a stabilization fund to support the currency.
And how did the West respond to Poland?
They immediately opened the checkbook.
Right.
$1 billion stabilization fund, massive debt cancellation. They did absolutely everything possible to ensure Poland succeeded.
Because the overarching goal was to integrate Poland into the West.
Correct. Now flip the calendar forward just a bit to 1991.
Okay.
Sachs is advising Gorbachev and later Yeltsin. The economic situation in Russia is almost identical to what Poland was facing.
Imploding.
The Soviet economy is imploding.
Yeah.
So Sachs goes back to Washington. He goes to the White House and says, we need the Poland deal.
Right. Give them the same package.
Exactly. He says, we need a stabilization fund to help Russia become a normal, functional market economy.
And the response this time?
A flat no.
Just a straight-up refusal.
Yes. Sachs says he later read the actual minutes of the meetings where these requests were discussed.
Oh, wow.
And he describes the attitude of the U.S. officials, specifically the Cheney and Wolfowitz types in the George H.W. Bush administration, as displaying flippancy, brazenness, and ignorance.
Flippancy. That is a really harsh characterization. Flippancy regarding the collapse of a nuclear superpower?
Well, they didn't view it as a crisis to be solved. They viewed it as a victory to be exploited.
Wow.
Sachs argues that the deep state, and we should clarify by that, he means the permanent security bureaucracy in D.C., not some shadowy conspiracy theory.
Right, the career planners.
Exactly. They preferred a chaotic, weak Russia over a stable one. They didn't want a normal Russia. They wanted a subordinate one.
It really brings up a painful what-if scenario.
It does.
Because if the U.S. had provided that stabilization fund in 1991, if they had treated Russia the way they treated Poland, would we be seeing tanks in Ukraine today?
Sachs argues absolutely not.
Really?
He suggests a prosperous, integrated Russia would have had no reason to become the revisionist power it is today.
That makes sense.
We wouldn't have seen the rise of hardliners like Putin
Yeah.
if the democratic transition hadn't been a time of absolute starvation and humiliation for the Russian public.
But the economic warfare was really just one prong of the strategy. We have to talk about the map again.
The expansion of NATO.
Yes. the expansion.
This is the original sin of the post-Cold War security order, according to the source material.
You hear this debated all the time, though. Western officials will constantly say, we never signed a treaty saying we wouldn't expand.
Right.
And Russian officials say, you promised us. What does the historical record actually show here?
The record strongly supports the betrayal narrative. It goes back to February 10th, 1990.
Set the scene for us there. What was happening?
So the Berlin Wall is down. Germany is divided. Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of West Germany, desperately wants to reunify the country.
Naturally.
But there's a massive logistical problem. The Soviet Union still has hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in East Germany.
So legally and militarily, the Soviets held the keys to reunification.
Exactly. Kohl couldn't just move forward without Gorbachev's permission. So a deal was struck.
Okay.
And the promise was explicit. If the Soviets allowed reunification and withdrew their troops, NATO would not extend its military structures 1 inch eastward.
Not 1 inch.
Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, stated it publicly.
Right.
James Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State, stated directly to Gorbachev. It was a fundamental quid for the quo of German unity.
And yet, starting in the late 90s, NATO began to add members anyway. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Sachs frames this as the U.S. and Germany flat out cheating.
He is particularly hard on Germany here.
Why Germany, specifically?
Because he argues that Germany was the primary beneficiary of the peace deal. They got their entire country back.
Right, they reunified.
They got the Soviet troops out without a single shot being fired. They, more than anyone, had a profound moral obligation to uphold the spirit of that agreement.
But they didn't. They became enthusiastic supporters of expansion.
They did. And this brings us to the moment where this strategy of rapid expansion finally hit a brick wall.
The 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest.
Exactly.
This seems to be the pivotal scene in the whole tragedy based on the source text.
It really is. So you have George W. Bush nearing the very end of his presidency.
Right.
And the U.S. delegation arrives in Bucharest, pushing incredibly aggressively for Ukraine and Georgia to be admitted into NATO.
Now, surely the Europeans saw the danger in this. I mean, Ukraine isn't just another country to Russia. It's their strategic core.
They absolutely saw it. Angela Merkel and the French leadership were horrified by the proposal.
I bet.
They warned Bush explicitly that this was a hard red line for Russia. They argued that bringing Ukraine into a military alliance hostile to Russia would absolutely guarantee a war.
So what actually happened in that room?
A classic disastrous diplomatic compromise.
Okay.
Merkel and the French blocked the immediate accession plan to prevent an instant crisis.
Right.
But under immense pressure from the U.S., they agreed to a joint declaration stating that Ukraine and Georgia will become members eventually.
Wait, so they announced the intention but provided absolutely no timeline and no security guarantee?
Yes. Sachs calls it the worst of both worlds.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It signaled to Russia that the U.S. was coming for Ukraine, effectively crossing that existential red line.
Yeah.
But it left Ukraine completely undefended while that happened.
It painted a giant target on the country without giving it a shield.
Exactly. And Sachs places the blame for this squarely on Western leadership. He calls it a failure of the deep state policies that Bush was following, but also a massive failure of Merkel to stand her ground.
Because she caved.
Right. He respects Merkel in many ways, but he views this as her fatal mistake. She knew it was wrong. She knew it would lead to conflict, but she just couldn't bring herself to break with the United States.
So that decision in 2008 basically started the clock.
It did.
But the real explosion didn't happen until 2014. And this is where the narrative in the deep dive gets very contentious.
The Maidan.
Right. In the West, we generally call it the Revolution of Dignity, a democratic uprising against a corrupt pro-Russian president.
Right.
But Sachs uses very different language to describe those events.
He explicitly refers to it as a U.S.-backed coup.
A coup. That is a really heavy charge, because a coup implies an illegitimate seizure of power.
He does.
What evidence does he cite to support that classification?
He points to several factors. The overt support from U.S. officials like Victoria Nuland, who was literally on the ground handing out food to protesters.
Right, I remember those photos.
And discussing on leaked phone calls who should be in the new government. But the real smoking gun for Sachs is the sequence of events on February 21st, 2014.
I feel like this specific date gets totally glossed over in most mainstream histories.
It does, but it is critical.
Yeah.
So on February 21st, the violence in Kiev was peaking.
Right, it was really bad.
The foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Poland flew to Kiev to manually broker a deal. They met with President Yanukovych and the opposition leaders.
And they actually reached an agreement.
They did. It was a formal binding pact.
Yeah.
Yanukovych agreed to give up power, but through a legal constitutional process.
Okay.
Early elections, a unity government, and constitutional reforms. The Europeans signed it as guarantors. Yanukovych signed it. The opposition signed it.
So on paper, a peaceful transition was totally secured.
For less than 24 hours.
Wow.
The very next day, February 22nd, the opposition, backed by what Sachs identifies as far-right paramilitary groups, stormed the government buildings.
And Yanukovych fled.
He fled for his life, yes.
Now, a skeptic listening to this might say, well, Yanukovych fled. He abandoned his post. So the parliament had to act to restore order.
That is the standard Western argument, yes.
Right.
But Sachs counters this by looking at the reaction of the guarantors.
Okay.
Germany, France, and Poland had just signed a deal keeping Yanukovych in office until elections. When he was overthrown by force, the very next day did they protest.
Did they say anything?
Did they say, wait, this violates the deal we literally just signed yesterday?
I assume not.
No. They recognized the new government immediately.
Just immediately validated it.
Yes. Sachs argues that this proves the intent was never a peaceful transition. The intent was regime change from the start.
And for Russia seeing that play out?
Right. For Russia, seeing the West sign a diplomatic agreement on a Tuesday and then just completely ignore it on a Wednesday because their guys won.
That destroys trust.
It destroyed the very concept of diplomatic trust entirely.
It reinforces the idea that treaties are just stall tactics.
Which brings us perfectly to the Minsk agreements in 2015. Yes, the Minsk deception, as the source frames it.
So this was the deal to stop the heavy fighting that broke out in the Donbass right after the Maidan.
Correct. The deal was supposed to grant the Donbass region political autonomy within Ukraine to end the violence.
Okay.
And once again, Germany and France were the guarantors of the deal.
Right.
But we now know, thanks to a stunning admission by Angela Merkel in 2022, that the West didn't actually view Minsk as a real peace deal.
She called it a holding period, right?
She did. She said it was an attempt to give Ukraine time to get stronger, to build up its army.
I mean, if you are Vladimir Putin and you hear the former chancellor of Germany openly admit that they were just buying time to arm your enemy,
right,
why would you ever negotiate with these people again?
That is Sachs's exact point.
Yeah.
He argues that the West has systematically dismantled the entire infrastructure of diplomacy.
Because you can't have peace if you view every negotiation as a trap.
Exactly. If diplomacy is just a trick to reload your weapons, there is no foundation for a settlement.
And this leads us directly to the current leadership. Because if the leaders of the 90s were delusional, according to Sachs, and the leaders of the 2000s were deceptive, Sachs seems to think the current crop is just simply incompetent.
He is incredibly scathing regarding the current German leadership especially.
Really?
He calls Chancellor Olaf Scholz impossibly weak and deeply confused.
Wow.
He argues that Scholz is acting entirely against Germany's own interests.
How so?
By destroying the German economy, cutting off the cheap Russian energy that powered their industrial base just to serve U.S. geopolitical goals.
And he also mentions Friedrich Merz, the opposition leader in Germany.
Yes. He criticizes Merz for basically beating the drums of war immediately rather than seeking any kind of dialogue.
Right.
Sachs outlines what a competent leader should do in this situation.
What's his playbook?
He says if you are a new chancellor, the very first thing you do is pick up the phone. You call Putin and say, I am new here. Let's try to find a solution.
The missing phone call.
Exactly. It hasn't happened. Instead, the prevailing narrative in Berlin and Washington is that merely talking to Putin is immoral.
That is a dangerous shift, isn't it? When diplomacy is framed not as a practical tool, but as a moral sin.
It paints you into an impossible corner.
Yeah.
Because if negotiation is appeasement, and appeasement is evil, then your only remaining option is total war. You actively remove all your own off-ramps.
And speaking of removing off-ramps, we have to discuss the role of Boris Johnson here.
The former British Prime Minister, yes.
Right.
Sachs literally labels him a culprit in this ongoing tragedy.
The culprit. That relates to the peace talks in Turkey, right?
Yes, the talks that took place in the spring of 2022.
Just weeks after the initial invasion.
Exactly. Both Ukrainian and Russian negotiators have since confirmed publicly that they were very close to a finalized deal.
What was the outline of that deal?
The outline was fairly straightforward. Russia withdraws to the pre-invasion lines, and in exchange, Ukraine guarantees strict neutrality.
Meaning no NATO.
No NATO.
I mean, looking back, it seems like a highly rational trade to save hundreds of thousands of lives. Why didn't it happen?
Well, according to the source material, And multiple reports since Boris Johnson flew out to Kiev and delivered a very clear message from the West.
Which was?
Do not sign this.
Just point blank.
Yes. The argument presented to Zelensky was that Putin was failing and the West could help Ukraine win a total military victory.
So they thought they could just bleed Russia out.
They treated it like a casino gamble. They were absolutely sure they were going to win.
Wow.
They genuinely thought Western sanctions would immediately collapse the Russian economy and that Western weapons would crush the Russian army in the field.
And this brings us right back to the board game analogy from earlier.
Exactly. Sachs says Western leaders act like children playing a board game.
Moving pieces around.
Moving pieces. Sanctions here, missiles there.
Yeah.
Thinking they can just hit reset on the board if the strategy goes wrong.
But you can't hit reset on reality.
No, because the pieces are real people. The cost of that specific gamble in 2022 has been hundreds of thousands of casualties and the near total destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure.
And the gamble didn't even pay off. The Russian economy didn't collapse.
Not at all.
Which leads us to what the source calls the geopolitical boomerang.
This is the massive, broader consequence of the war that the U.S. didn't anticipate.
Right.
The U.S. thought it could isolate Russia globally. But they were operating on that outdated mental map we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The unipolar map, the 15% versus the 85%.
Tax really breaks down the math on this. The U.S. coalition, meaning Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, they represent about 12 to 15% of the world's population.
Okay.
They honestly thought that 15% was enough to dictate terms to the entire planet.
But the other 85%?
The global majority.
Yeah.
The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus much of the rest of Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Right. What did they do?
They didn't join the sanctions.
They just opted out.
They looked at this conflict and saw a regional European war that was heavily provoked by NATO expansion. They didn't see it as a global moral crusade that they needed to sacrifice their own economies for.
And critically, that meant Russia actually had somewhere to go.
Right. Remember Brzezinski back in the 90s predicted that Russia would have absolutely no choice but to submit to the West because it supposedly couldn't turn east?
Right.
He specifically mocked the idea of a Russia-China alliance as impossible.
And yet today, Russia and China are closer than they have ever been in history.
It is a strategic nightmare for the U.S. Sachs points out the sheer tragedy of it for Europe, too.
Because they were connected?
Economically, Europe and Russia were a perfect fit. Europe desperately needs cheap energy. Russia has it. Russia needs advanced technology and consumer goods. Europe has it.
It was a highly symbiotic relationship.
And the West completely severed it.
Cut it right off.
And now Russia has found that exact same fit with China. China needs vast amounts of energy. Russia has it. China has massive industrial capacity. Russia needs it.
Wow.
We have effectively forced our two biggest geopolitical rivals into a marriage of convenience that is rapidly becoming a marriage of necessity.
It is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The entire U.S. strategy to prevent a rival has literally created a much stronger unified rival.
It completely exposes the delusion of the American mental map.
Yeah, let's talk about that map again.
Sachs says the U.S. deep state looks at the world and sees it in these absurdly simplistic terms.
Like what?
They look and say the Americas. That's ours. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Europe. Those are our vassals. They do what we say. The Middle East. We control it or we bomb it. Africa. That is just a place to get cobalt and minerals.
It is a deeply imperial mindset operating in a post-imperial world.
And the rest of the world is finally saying no. They are actively building their own payment systems, their own independent trade route.
Bypassing the system entirely.
They are accelerating away from the U.S. dollar because they clearly see that the U.S. will weaponize it the second they disagree with you.
There is a specific anecdote in the source material that really captures this historic hubris for me. It's a joke told by Joe Biden way back in 1997.
Oh, yes. That is a really haunting detail to look back on now.
It really is.
This was back when Biden was a senator. He was giving a major speech at the Atlantic Council arguing forcefully for NATO expansion.
Right.
And he mentioned during the speech that Russian diplomats had warned him privately that if NATO continued to push east, Russia might be forced to look to China for an alliance.
And what was Biden's reaction to that warning?
He laughed about it on stage. He told the audience, I said to them, good luck with that. And if that doesn't work, try Iran.
And the audience reaction?
A whole room burst into laughter. They legitimately thought the idea of a Russia-China-Iran axis was a hilarious joke.
And today?
Today, Russia is conducting massive joint naval exercises with China and actively buying advanced military drones from Iran. The funniest joke in Washington in 1997 became the grim strategic reality that now totally confronts them.
It reminds me of the other historical comparison Sachs makes in the discussion, the reference to Joseph Chamberlain.
Yes, back in 1897.
Exactly 100 years before Biden's speech.
Chamberlain was a titan of the British Empire. He gave a very famous speech declaring that the British Empire was fundamentally unchallengeable.
Right.
That it spanned the entire globe and would effectively last forever.
And within 50 years of that speech,
the empire was completely gone. Bankrupt, dissolved, and replaced.
Pride before the fall.
That is the ultimate warning of the source material. Sachs is trying to tell us that the unwavering belief that you can run the world, that you are the indispensable nation, is the exact mindset that permanently blinds you to reality.
Yeah.
It leads you to overextend your forces, to pick fights you really don't need to pick, and ultimately to lose your standing entirely.
Man, this has been an incredibly heavy deep dive.
It covers a lot of intense ground.
We have traveled from the bright optimism of the Berlin Wall, coming down to the bloody stalemate in the trenches in Ukraine, and the fracturing of the entire global economic order.
So where does this actually leave us?
Well, if we accept the rigorous analysis provided by Sachs and Deason, it leaves us staring at a very stark binary choice.
Okay, there are the options.
We can continue down the current path of hegemony. We can double down, risk further escalation, maybe even risk nuclear war to try to violently force the world back into the neat little box of 1992.
Which really seems to be the current trajectory.
It does.
Because Sachs explicitly mentions that the U.S. is now attempting to apply this exact same regime change playbook to Venezuela and increasing military pressure on Iran to prove a point.
Right. He argues the U.S. is behaving like a desperate gambler chasing losses at the table. Just thinking if we push a little harder here, we can prove to everyone we are still the boss.
Or we take the other path.
Right. Or we can finally choose the path that was so disastrously rejected in 1990, the path of normalcy.
What does that look like today? It means accepting that the U.S. is a great power, but not the only power.
Right.
Accepting that other major nations like Russia and China have legitimate historical security interests that we actually have to respect, even if we deeply dislike their forms of government.
It sounds so simple on paper, but it requires a complete rewiring of the Western foreign policy mind.
It does.
It requires Washington admitting that the board game is finally over.
It does require that. But Sachs would argue that the alternative to that admission is just absolute catastrophe.
I think the most powerful takeaway for me today is really about the timeline.
Yeah, the timeline is everything.
The next time a major conflict erupts somewhere in the world, and the nightly news tells me it started today,
Right.
I am going to pause.
Always check the timeline. Don't take the starting gun at face value.
Exactly. I am going to ask, did this really start when the shooting started? Or did it actually start decades ago in some quiet meeting room where someone decided that total dominance was simply more important than lasting peace?
That is exactly the question that matters most.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you all next time.